Welcome to CityWorks, a production of the City University New York School of Labor and Urban Studies and CUNY TV. I'm Laura Flanders. Every month, CityWorks explores the lives of working people on the job, at home, in our communities, in order to see how to advance an agenda of social justice and economic equality. On today's program, we're discussing the nation's railroad workers, the critical work they carry out, and their goals. The tragic accident at East Palestine, Ohio earlier this year brought railroads front and center, with the entire country for a moment focused on the enormous importance of and critical condition of the rail industry. Today, to talk about that is Jeff Schuhrke, Assistant Professor of Labor Studies at the Harry Van Arsdale Jr. School of Labor Studies at SUNY Empire State University. Quite a mouthful. Professor Schuhrke wears a lot of hats as a labor historian, journalist, and union activist. And a little bit we'll be joined by Ron Kaminkow, a locomotive engineer and co-founder of Railworkers United. Welcome to the program, Jeff. So glad to have you with us. You have a smile on your face today, but had we been speaking this time last year, I don't think you would have been looking so cheery. What were we looking at?
Well, a year ago right now, and thank you for having me, by the way, a year ago right now, the 12 different railroad unions were in the middle of negotiating a new contract with a coalition of the main railroad carriers in the country. And it was looking possible that they might be heading towards a national strike. It would have been about 115,000 freight railroad workers on strike, which is very rare in this day and age.
What were the demands at that time? Just to take people back, we were just emerging out of the COVID pandemic. The economy was kind of trying to find its feet. It was awkward, difficult times, and workers had some serious demands all across the country's workforce. Inside the railroad workers, what were the main things they were looking for in a new contract?
One of the main things, of course, was paid sick leave, more paid time off in general. This is because over the last several years, the rail carriers have been implementing a business strategy called precision scheduled railroading, or PSR.
And what does that mean?
It's sort of a lean production model of cutting costs to the bone, cutting labor costs, cutting back on modernizing facilities and infrastructure, all designed to maximize profits, basically cutting operating costs so that they can maximize their profits and then use the profits, instead of investing it into the workforce by hiring more workers, to for stock buybacks and dividends to just further line their pockets. So the railroad industry is tremendously profitable right now. I think last year was something like $22 billion in profits. But over the last 6 or 7 years, the rail labor force has shrunk considerably, 30% or 45,000 workers, 45,000 fewer workers. So that puts more demand and more strain on the rail workers who are already there. And a lot of the rail companies were, during the pandemic and coming out of the pandemic, implementing new, more strict, draconian attendance policies. So this was a sort of a major concern of the workers and of the unions, wanting more staffing, first of all, so that they can be able to take time off and to obviously have paid sick leave, which is, like you said, it's really unimaginable that workers, especially workers so critical and essential to the economy, very skilled workers, wouldn't even have something as simple as paid sick leave.
All right, so, I mean, freight is different from passenger travel, but I remember when President Biden was campaigning for office, he often told his story of traveling on Amtrak to and from his home to Washington, D.C. He seemed like a big railroad supporter. In addition to that, he was a big union supporter. He says he is a big pro-union president. What happened in the fall?
So it's important that the context here is that union negotiations in the rail industry are different from most other private sector workers in that they're under a different law, the Railway Labor Act, which dates back to 1926. And to make a long story short, the Railway Labor Act has it's sort of designed to prevent railroad workers from going on strike. It has multiple steps they have to go through in negotiations. They have to go through mediation. They have to have a presidential emergency board be appointed of experts to review the situation and offer recommendations, and then several what they call cooling off periods of 30 days where nothing happens, all that before they can even go on strike. And then at the end of that, under the law, Congress has the ability to step in and just impose an agreement to stop a strike.
So just to underscore, I mean, this is unusual, if not unique. You don't have Congress and a presidential board intervening in most labor negotiations.
Right. Most other private sector workers are under the National Labor Relations Act, which was passed during the New Deal and gives workers a lot more leeway in bargaining and going on strike.
But still, you have a Democratic-controlled Congress, you have a pro-union, pro-Amtrak president. You'd think things would go well for this intervention.
Yeah, so so they had gone through all those many steps over the course of about almost 3 years of negotiations and going through these steps. And when they finally got close to the point of going on strike, the railroad companies and the media and several other business interests and politicians, including Joe Biden, started kind of fear-mongering. If there's a strike, it's going to implode the whole economy. It's going to be chaos.
I remember presents won't reach the stores in time for Christmas.
Exactly, which, that's right. So President Biden called on Congress to impose. So what I should back up. There was the Labor Department, Labor Secretary at the time, Marty Walsh, and President Biden helped to broker a tentative agreement between the rail unions and the rail carriers. And then this tentative agreement did not include the paid sick leave, the main thing that the workers had been asking for. So some of the unions voted narrowly to ratify this tentative agreement, but 4 unions, including some of the biggest rail unions that represent a majority of the rail labor workforce, they voted down this tentative agreement. And then they were once again, this is why by December then they were again about to go on strike. And that's when Congress intervened and overrode union democracy. The members had voted down this deal, and Congress, with President Biden's approval, and he signed the law after Congress passed it, imposing this contract on the workers that they had not wanted.
So for many people, that's where the story ended. A defeat for the unions, an awkward step for the president, and the media kind of lost attention because it was after Christmas, the presidents had arrived. But that isn't where the story ended.
It's really important in this story that there is, during this last year's, everything that was happening last year, the contract negotiations, a really strong rank and file movement from the workers, particularly a group called Railworkers United, RWU, which is a inter-union cross-craft solidarity caucus. And they kept the pressure on their union leaders and on the companies and on the government. And I think the rail companies realized that they got a lot of negative attention in the media for not allowing any paid sick leave. And then you mentioned the East Palestine, Ohio disaster this February with Norfolk Southern, one of the major rail carriers behind that. And that was more negative publicity for them. So they started to kind of quietly, one by one, different railroad companies and unions come back to the table just over that issue of paid sick leave. And I think several unions passed something like, or they reached deals of something like 4 days of paid sick leave, which is still not very much. And again, in the negotiations, they had wanted 15 days, and then Congress had tried to get them 7 days, and now they're getting maybe 4 days. So it's a step forward for sure, but I think a lot of railroaders that I've talked to, especially those associated with Railroad Workers United, would say that it's an ongoing fight, and it's really the rank and file who are pushing for these things.
Well, we're going to take a quick break and come back with a member of the rank and file, a locomotive engineer, as well as an organizer and one of the co-founders of Railroad Workers United. Ron Kaminkow will join us right after this. Don't go away.
The CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies is the 25th and newest school under the CUNY umbrella. Dedicated to public service and social justice, the CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies offers undergraduate and graduate degrees in the areas of labor studies and urban studies, and certificate programs in labor relations, public administration and public policy, healthcare policy and administration, and community leadership. We pride ourselves on being an institution that brings together activists and academics. Find out more at slu.cuny.edu.
Joining us now is Ron Kaminkow, who is an organizer for Railroad Workers United and also a locomotive engineer. He's one of the co-founders of RWU. Ron, welcome to the program. Glad to have you joining us here on CityWorks. How would you describe the situation right now?
The situation on the railroad is an interesting one. I never thought in my 27 years on the railroad that I would actually live to see it. It's interesting what's happened in the last year or so. There's a lot of focus upon railroad workers, railroad worker issues, and the industry as a whole. And really, we were granted a golden opportunity last fall when the rail carriers dug their heels in and refused to really bargain with us over the issues of quality of work life. And as a result, the media was very, very interested in what was going on. And for the first time really ever that I have seen in my working life, media, both small and large, gravitated to the issue and were very, very willing to listen to the voices of rank and file working railroaders. You know, that brings us to today where, surprise, surprise, even though the rail carriers were adamantly opposed to granting any form of sick time. Not one day of sick time was actually granted in that master contract that was finally basically shoved down our throats back in the fall. But fast forward 6 short months later, and I believe all the crafts on Union Pacific, all the crafts and unions on Norfolk Southern, and probably soon to be followed by the rest of the Class 1 carriers, sick time has been granted. It's limited, but it's 100% more than what the carriers were willing to come forth with back in the fall. So why the change of heart? What happened? And there's a lot of rumors and a lot of misinformation. For example, people think Joe Biden behind the scenes is somehow getting these big, powerful corporations to do the right thing. This is obviously nonsense. And then there's also the belief that, well, the carriers, you know, they're changing CEOs and managers left and right, playing the game of musical chairs at the upper echelons. And so the thought is, oh, well, now they're becoming more compassionate. They finally understood that their workforce needs time off the job, and they're going to be nice and generous. Well, that's obviously nonsense as well. And last but not least is the idea that somehow the union leadership has managed to coax, cajole, pressure, and otherwise force the carriers to give them sick time. Well, that's obviously nonsense because the rail unions had 2.5 years at the bargaining table in national handling and were not capable of extracting a single day of sick time.
So if it wasn't all of those things, what was it?
Well, I'm about to get to this. So yeah, Laura, in answer to your question, what was it? The immense pressure that the rank and file was able to exert. The fact that unions representing a majority of railroad workers working for Class 1 freight railroads voted down that contract. The fact that every time you turned on the TV or the radio or went onto the internet, there it was once again, working railroaders telling the story of the exorbitant profits, the stock buybacks, the lack of sick time, the lack of paid leave, the draconian attendance policies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this puts enormous pressure upon the carriers to finally realize something has got to be done. And that's how we were able to actually turn lemons into lemonade.
Well, I want to take the opportunity, given that you are a locomotive engineer, to ask you a little bit about what your work life is actually like these days. I watched a train go under through a train tunnel the other day from above. I think I was there for 25 minutes watching this thing pass by. Huge, enormous trains these days with very few people working on them. What's it like to be an engineer on one of these trains? And when the East Ohio, the East Palestine accident happened, how was that for you?
Well, I actually am a freight railroad refugee from many years ago. I now work in passenger service, so I do not work for a Class 1 freight carrier. I did work for Norfolk Southern, and before that I worked for a railroad called Conrail that was largely carved up in a corporate takeover back in 1999. So as a passenger engineer, my experience is a little different. We theoretically run to schedule, and our trains are chronically late. And in most cases, the majority of time lost is for freight train interference. And this has historically been the case. Now enter precision scheduled railroading, so-called, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10 years ago, depending on what railroad you work on. One of the hallmarks of PSR is to build extremely long trains to gain the efficiencies of running one long train as opposed to, let's say, 2 shorter trains. These trains don't tend to fit into many of the sidings on railroads. They have a greater propensity to break down and have issues with drawbars, with knuckles, with air hoses, with end of train device linkages, and so forth. And then when they do break down because of their length, it takes longer to find the problem and correct that problem. So these trains are delay makers. And there are many times in the last few years that I have been delayed 15 minutes, a half hour, an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, or longer due to these long, cumbersome trains. And they don't just interfere with the Amtrak passenger trains, they actually make the railroad a much less efficient place, even for the movement of freight.
In terms of learnings from the last year, what are your 2 or 3 takeaways? One, obviously, don't wait for the president to do it. But what else?
Well, there's a lot that railroad workers can learn from this whole fiasco of the last year. First of all, yeah, we cannot rely on government officials, regardless of what political party they come from, and regardless of what their political persuasion is. And I think that's been proven beyond a shadow of a doubt by the foolishness of this last contract debacle. Also, if we're going to be successful in our next round of bargaining, we can't leave it to union leaders and company officials behind closed doors with a gag order that the rank and file simply sits on the sidelines and waits until there's finally a tentative agreement or a presidential emergency board. Bargaining starts long before the actual formal bargaining at the table starts. We need to get the members involved from day one. And so I would say that is a second takeaway. And then last but not least, the schisms between the craft unions on the railroad. We have 12 or 13, depending on how you slice it. We can't go on this way. It's crippling us. And so in the next round of bargaining, we either have to get busy and amalgamate these unions, and barring that, and I don't think that the union leadership is going to be amenable to amalgamating these unions. So barring that, we need an ironclad coalition of every union at bargaining. No union settles, no craft settles until every craft is happy. And that way we maintain unity and solidarity throughout the bargaining process. And we then can prevent politicians from playing this off against each other and so forth. But we must go into bargaining as a united railroad workforce.
Quickly before we wrap, Jeff, I want to bring you and your work back into this story. These questions of consolidation, democracy, militancy are being raised across the labor movement right now. What do you think is happening in this era in terms of movement on those issues? And what does the future look like? We've got some huge contracts coming down the pike this fall.
Yeah, I mean, people are calling this, the hot labor summer. There's clearly a huge strike wave going on right now in Hollywood with the writers, the actors, both on strike together for the first time in 63 years, going up against these huge, movie studios and streamers that, just like the railroad companies, making billions and billions of dollars, but not able to provide good quality of life or steady kind of employment for their workers. Ron was talking about UPS and the Teamsters and the agreement that they reached by almost going on strike. And then this fall, the big three automakers, Ford, GM, and Stellantis, their contract with the United Auto Workers will be expiring, so negotiations are already beginning on that. And Ron mentioned the Teamsters. They have new leadership. The rank and file elected, a new president just a couple years ago, Sean O'Brien, and other new leaders. And similarly with the UAW, they recently elected a new president. So I think that's part of what's happening here is the rank and file being more organized and putting more pressure and having more democracy within their unions. But in general, I think, especially coming out of the pandemic, a lot of workers in all different sectors, all industries, this also includes Amazon workers and Starbucks workers, among many others, are realizing how much they've been exploited for so long. I think the pandemic was kind of in some ways a reset for a lot of people with the state of emergency, especially a lot of essential workers, including railroad workers who had to continue going to work, including UPS drivers, deemed essential, fast food workers, grocery store workers, people who are low-wage workers being told they're essential. They're putting their lives on the line for these companies, and they get virtually nothing in return, lots of disrespect. And I also think, when one group of workers or when one union stands up, as the rank and file railroaders did last year, and really, voting down the contract that they didn't want, and things like that, that inspires other workers in other industries. And when they see, for example, the Teamsters at UPS securing what may be a good contract, I mean, it's up to the rank and file to decide what they think of that tentative agreement. But when they see people standing up, going on strike, winning victories, it inspires, people to say, I can do that too, we can do that too.
I mean, apart from anything else, it inspires them not to make concessions before they start negotiating.
Exactly.
To actually hold out for what they really want. Jeff, staying with you for a second on this question of aspiration. I've heard Ron talk about taking the profit motive out of maybe just freight rail altogether, possibly freight and passenger rail. Is that a conversation yet? And is that a conversation you think is brewing?
Yeah, I think it is a conversation. We've been talking a lot over the last several years about nationalizing our healthcare, like most other countries in the world do. And why not us? And I think because of RWU and folks like Ron, there is beginning to be a conversation around nationalizing the railroads. The United States is kind of unique in that we're one of the only countries in the world where our freight railroad system is totally privatized.
Ron, do you want to weigh in on this? You said you didn't believe you would be where you are today. Could you imagine a future where we are looking at nationalized railroads, and would you be in favor?
Railroad Workers United has considered this issue for more than a dozen years. We have talked about it at our conventions. And in fact, this last convention in June of 2022, we finally decided the time is right. One of the things that's worth looking at before people think, well, this is kind of a radical idea, isn't it? Other infrastructure in this country in transportation is publicly owned.
Yeah.
The highways, whether it's the interstate system, the old U.S. Highway system, county roads, state highways, it's all owned by the public. The waterways, there's huge freight traffic on the Mississippi, the Missouri, the Ohio. Nobody owns those rivers. They're owned publicly, and they're administered by the Army Corps of Engineers.
No, I'm worried he's giving them ideas for what to privatize next. Before we go to, thank you so much, Ron. Jeff, final question for you. There's an environmental context for all of this. Ron talked about the short term. It's not even the short term. It's right now. We're looking at the climate effects of global climate change. This discussion about how we move people and products around the country has climate implications too. To what extent do you think we're considering those, looking at those as we talk about this? Well,
I should say that right now in Erie, Pennsylvania, since June 22nd, the people who make the locomotive engines at Wabtec have been on strike with United Electrical Workers, UE. And UE has put forward a proposal, I believe RWU has also endorsed this, for more like green locomotives, locomotive engines that are more modern, fit what they call Tier 4 EPA standards that emit less carbon and use less fossil fuels. Yeah, I mean, I think, I don't know the exact figures, but I believe freight rail is one of the least polluting types of transportation in the country. So this again gets back to what we could be doing if we had a publicly owned freight rail system, modernizing the engines, modernizing the rail infrastructure in general, so that it's more energy efficient, it's cleaner. Green, yeah.
I can see the future. Green, publicly owned, union run. It's a bright future, and I hope that we are talking about it not too long from now. That's it for CityWorks. Thank you, Labor Studies professor and journalist Jeff Schuhrke, and RWU organizer and co-founder Ron Kaminkow. Learn more about the RWU at www.railroadworkersunited.org. And if you have comments or questions about this show, write to us at cityworks@slu.cuny.edu. For CityWorks, I'm Laura Flanders. Thanks for joining us.